Monk's Mound, the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not a natural hill, not an accident of geology, but a structure built entirely by human hands, basket by basket, over generations, rising 40 meters above the floodplain of the Mississippi River. Yet most people in the modern world have never heard of it. The city it once anchored, a place we now call Cahokia, held a population that rivaled London at the time of its peak. It organized labor on a continental scale. It reshaped the spiritual, political, and agricultural life of an entire hemisphere's interior. And then, within a few centuries, it was gone. How does a city of that magnitude rise, flourish, and vanish so completely that even its name is lost to history? If this kind of deeply researched, seriously told history is what you come here for, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. Every action you take genuinely helps this channel keep producing work like this, and helps more people discover stories that deserve to be heard. What follows is not a simple story of rise and fall. It is something stranger and more unsettling than that. We will travel back more than 1,000 years to a landscape that most people imagine as empty wilderness, and we will find it crowded, ambitious, and politically charged. We will watch a society transform itself with breathtaking speed, building a city almost overnight by historical standards, and then pushing that city to a breaking point through the very forces that made it great. We will encounter a ruler whose authority seems to have been almost supernatural in the eyes of his people, a population that moved across the continent in response to Cahokia's gravity, and a collapse that scholars are still arguing about today. By the end, you will understand not only what Cahokia was, but why it matters, why its disappearance is one of the most consequential and least understood events in North American history, and what it reveals about the fragility of every complex society that has ever tried to organize the world around a single center of power. To understand Cahokia, you first need to understand the landscape it grew from. The American bottom is a broad floodplain on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, just south of where the Missouri River joins from the west and the Illinois River flows in from the north. This confluence of three major river systems created one of the most biologically productive environments in the interior of North America. The floodplain was rich with fish, waterfowl, deer, and wild plant foods. The soil, renewed each year by flooding, was extraordinarily fertile, and the river networks provided natural highways stretching in every direction, connecting the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, the Appalachian foothills to the Great Plains. People had lived in this region for thousands of years before Cahokia emerged. The earliest secure evidence of human habitation in the American bottom reaches back well into the period we call the Archaic, roughly from 8,000 to 1,000 before Common Era. These were mobile or semi-mobile communities, moving through the landscape in seasonal patterns, harvesting the enormous resources the river system provided. Over time, some of these communities began to settle more permanently. They started cultivating plants, first native seed plants like goosefoot and maygrass, and later, crucially, maize, which had been domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier and spread northward through a long and complex process of agricultural diffusion. By around 500 Common Era, the people of the American bottom were part of what scholars call the woodland tradition, a broad cultural pattern found across much of eastern North America. Woodland communities built burial mounds, maintained long-distance trade networks, and lived in relatively small, dispersed villages. They were not politically centralized, and no single community dominated the region. The American bottom was inhabited, but not yet transformed. That transformation was still several centuries away, and when it came with a speed that still astonishes researchers today. Sometime around 800 to 900 Common Era, a shift began. Maize agriculture, which had been a minor supplement to the diet, started becoming a staple crop. The reasons for this transition are still debated. Some scholars point to the development of a new variety of maize better adapted to the shorter growing seasons of the upper Midwest. Others emphasize population growth that made intensive agriculture necessary. Still others point to changes in climate, particularly a warm period between roughly 900 and 1200 Common Era that made maize cultivation more reliable across a broader range of latitudes. The most careful view is that all of these factors interacted, with no single cause being sufficient on its own. What is clear is that as maize agriculture intensified, population in the American bottom began to grow, communities became larger, storage capacity increased. The ability to produce a reliable food surplus year after year created new possibilities for social organization. A surplus can be stored, redistributed, taxed, or used to feed specialists who do not grow their own food. It can support leaders, priests, craft workers, builders, and soldiers. It can be used to attract followers and reward loyalty. In short, a reliable agricultural surplus is one of the basic preconditions for complex political organization, and by around 900 to 1000 Common Era, the American bottom had that surplus. The settlements of this period, which researchers call the emergent Mississippian phase, were growing in size and complexity. Communities began organizing around central plazas. Some sites show evidence of communal feasting, a practice that in many societies serves as a mechanism for building political alliances and reinforcing social hierarchies. Leaders were beginning to emerge who could coordinate labor, organize ceremonies, and manage the redistribution of resources. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the history of the North American interior. Then, around 1000 Common Era, something happened that researchers have called the Cahokia Big Bang. Within what appears to be a single generation, perhaps 50 years at most, the settlement at Cahokia transformed from a large village into a genuine urban center. The scale of change is so dramatic and so rapid that it remains one of the most debated questions in North American archaeology. How did a community make that leap so quickly? What drove it? And who was behind it? The physical evidence is extraordinary. Monk's Mound. The Great Central Pyramid was not built all at once, but its earliest construction phases date to this period. The Grand Plaza, a leveled and prepared open space covering nearly 50 hectares at the center of the site, was created through an enormous engineering effort that required removing hills, filling in low areas, and laying down a prepared surface. This plaza was large enough to contain several modern city blocks, and it served as the ceremonial and political heart of the city. Surrounding it were dozens of smaller mounds, some serving as platforms for elite buildings, others as burial sites, and still others whose function is not yet fully understood. The city that grew around this core was not just a ceremonial center visited occasionally by dispersed rural populations. Researchers have identified dense residential zones surrounding the central precinct with houses packed closely together in patterns, suggesting a genuinely urban population. Population estimates vary considerably, and historians and archaeologists are honest about the difficulty of these calculations, but the most widely cited figures suggest that Cahokia may have held between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city itself at its peak, around 1100 to 1200 Common Era, with a broader regional population in the tens of thousands more. To put that in context, London at the same moment in history held perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people. Cahokia was not a backwater. It was a world-class city by the standards of its time. One of the most striking verified facts about Cahokia's rapid growth is that researchers have found evidence of a massive, sudden influx of people from across the region. Isotope analysis of human remains, which can reveal where a person grew up based on chemical signatures preserved in their bones and teeth, shows that a significant portion of Cahokia's population was not born there. People came from hundreds of kilometers away, drawn by whatever Cahokia represented, whether that was economic opportunity, spiritual authority, political protection, or some combination of all three. This was not just natural population growth. Cahokia was pulling people in from across the continental interior. What made Cahokia so attractive? The answer almost certainly lies in the intersection of political authority, religious power, and economic advantage. The leaders of Cahokia appear to have claimed a kind of sacred authority that went far beyond ordinary chieftainship. The layout of the city, with its massive central mound, its carefully aligned plazas, and its orientation to astronomical events like the solstices and equinoxes, suggests a cosmological program. The city was designed to express and reinforce a claim that its rulers stood at the center of the universe, mediating between the human world and the spiritual forces that governed the cosmos. This kind of sacred kingship, where a ruler is understood to be not merely a political leader, but a living embodiment of cosmic order, is found in many societies around the world at various points in history. What makes Cahokia distinctive is that it appears to have emerged in North America with remarkable completeness and sophistication, in a region where nothing quite like it had existed before. The Cahokian political religious system was, in a meaningful sense, a new invention, and its novelty was part of what made it so powerful. The evidence for this sacred authority is most dramatically visible in what researchers have called Mound 72, a small ridgetop burial mound located south of the Grand Plaza. Excavated in the 1960s and 70s, this mound contained the burials of several individuals whose treatment in death speaks volumes about their status in life. The most famous of these is a man buried on a platform made of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, almost certainly a falcon, one of the most powerful symbols in Mississippian religious iconography. Surrounding him were the remains of dozens of other individuals, mostly young women, who appear to have been sacrificed and deposited in mass graves nearby. Other offerings included arrowheads by the hundreds, copper sheets, and the remains of other high-status individuals. The falcon imagery is significant. Across many North American cultures, the falcon or thunderbird was associated with the sky world, with warriors, and with a kind of divine power that operated above and beyond ordinary human constraints. A ruler buried as a falcon was making a claim not just to political authority, but to a position between worlds. He was, in the understanding of his people, something more than human. The scale of the sacrificial offerings in Mound 72 is deeply uncomfortable to contemplate, and it should be. It tells us that Cahokia's political system was capable of extraordinary violence, that the authority of its rulers was backed not just by persuasion and redistribution, but by the power of life and death over other human beings. This was not a gentle, consensus-based chieftainship. It was something harder and more demanding. And yet people came to Cahokia by the thousands, apparently willingly, suggesting that the system offered enough in return to make the bargain worth accepting for most of those who entered it. What did Cahokia offer? Part of the answer is economic. The city sat at the center of a trade network that stretched across much of North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, chert from distant quarries, and exotic minerals from across the continent all flowed through Cahokia. The city's craft workers produced distinctive objects, particularly ceramic vessels in a style called Ramey incised, decorated with complex cosmological imagery that had been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away. Cahokia was not just consuming trade goods. It was producing and distributing objects that carried ideological weight, spreading its symbolic system along with its material goods. Another part of the answer is food. The agricultural productivity of the American bottom was exceptional, and a city the size of Cahokia required enormous quantities of food. The surrounding countryside was organized to produce that food, with rural farming communities providing tribute or participating in redistribution systems centered on the city. Feasting was a central part of Cahokian political life, and the ability to host large communal meals, drawing people together and creating bonds of obligation and loyalty, was a key tool of political management. Researchers have found evidence of large-scale communal cooking and feasting at multiple locations within the city, suggesting that the redistribution of food was not just an economic function, but a deeply social and political one. Cahokia also offered something harder to quantify, but perhaps most important of all, meaning. The city was a place where the cosmos made sense, where the relationship between the human world and the spiritual world was visible in stone and earth and ceremony. For people living in smaller communities across the interior, Cahokia may have represented a kind of sacred center, a place where the world was properly ordered, and where participation in its rituals connected you to something larger than your own village. This is not speculation. The spread of Cahokian religious iconography, the so-called Southeastern ceremonial complex, across a huge area of North America, suggests that Cahokia's spiritual influence extended far beyond its political reach. By around 1100 to 1150 Common Era, Cahokia was at or near the height of its power. The central precinct was surrounded by a massive wooden palisade, a defensive wall made of thousands of large posts, which was rebuilt at least 4 times over the course of the city's history. This wall enclosed the most sacred and politically sensitive areas of the city, separating the elite and ceremonial core from the surrounding residential zones. The construction of such a wall required enormous quantities of timber, and researchers have estimated that each rebuilding of the palisade required cutting down thousands of mature trees. The environmental cost of Cahokia's political ambitions was not trivial. Beyond the palisade, the city spread outward in a complex pattern of residential neighborhoods, smaller mound groups, and open spaces. Researchers have identified what appear to be distinct residential zones that may have housed different social groups, whether defined by kinship, occupation, geographic origin, or some combination of these. The city was not a uniform mass of undifferentiated population. It was organized, stratified, and internally differentiated in ways that reflect a sophisticated and complex social order. One of the most remarkable features of Cahokia's landscape is the series of large circular arrangements of wooden posts that researchers have found at several locations within and near the city. These structures, sometimes called woodhenges because of their superficial resemblance to Stonehenge in England, were oriented to mark the positions of sunrise and sunset at the solstices and equinoxes. They appear to have served as astronomical calendars, allowing Cahokia's priests or leaders to track the solar year and time the ceremonies that governed the agricultural and ritual calendar. The precision required to construct these alignments correctly was considerable, and their existence suggests a sophisticated body of astronomical knowledge maintained by a specialized priestly class. The political reach of Cahokia extended well beyond the American bottom. At its peak, the city appears to have exercised some form of influence or authority over communities across a huge area, from the western bank of the Mississippi into what is now Missouri, northward into Wisconsin and Minnesota, eastward into Indiana and Ohio, and southward toward the Gulf Coast. The nature of this influence is debated. Some researchers see Cahokia as a true regional state, with administrative control over subordinate communities. Others argue for a looser model, in which Cahokia's influence was primarily ideological and economic rather than political, with communities adopting Cahokian practices and symbols without necessarily being governed by Cahokian rulers. The truth was probably somewhere between these positions, and it likely varied by region and over time. What is clear is that the Cahokian world was not static. Communities across the interior were responding to Cahokia's existence, whether by adopting its practices, resisting its demands, or being drawn into its orbit. The city was not a passive center surrounded by passive hinterlands. It was an active force reshaping the human geography of an entire continent's interior. And then things began to change. The signs of stress appear in the archaeological records sometime in the mid-12th century, roughly 1150 to 1200 Common Era. The evidence is subtle at first, but it accumulates into a picture of a society under growing pressure from multiple directions. One of the clearest signs of trouble is the rebuilding of the palisade. The wall around the central precinct was rebuilt multiple times, each time apparently in response to some threat or perceived threat. The scale of labor required for these rebuildings was enormous, and the fact that they happened repeatedly suggests that the city's leadership felt genuinely vulnerable. Whether this vulnerability was internal, from discontented factions within the city, or external from hostile communities in the surrounding region, or both, is not certain. At the same time, researchers have found evidence of what appears to be increasing inequality within the city. The gap between elite and non-elite material culture seems to have widened over time. Elite residences became larger and more elaborately furnished. Non-elite residential areas show signs of crowding and resource stress. The redistribution system that had helped bind the city together may have been breaking down, with resources flowing increasingly toward the top of the social hierarchy rather than circulating broadly through the population. There are also signs of environmental stress. The construction demands of a city the size of Cahokia put enormous pressure on the surrounding landscape. Forests were cleared for timber, for fuel, and for agricultural land. Deforestation on this scale can lead to erosion, soil degradation, and changes in local hydrology. Some researchers have argued that the flooding patterns of the American bottom may have become more severe as forest cover declined, potentially damaging the agricultural base on which the city depended. Others point to evidence of drought conditions in the 12th and 13th centuries that may have reduced agricultural yields and strained the city's food supply. The question of climate is particularly important. The medieval warm period that had helped make Cahokia's agricultural expansion possible was giving way, by the 13th century, to a more variable and sometimes harsher climate. Tree ring records from the region show evidence of severe droughts in the late 12th and 13th centuries. For a city that depended on reliable agricultural surpluses to feed its population and sustain its political system, prolonged drought would have been catastrophic. A leader whose authority rested partly on claims of cosmic power and the ability to maintain natural order would have faced a severe legitimacy crisis if the rains failed year after year. But climate alone cannot explain Cahokia's decline. Human choices, political failures, and social conflicts were at least as important. The very success of Cahokia created problems that its political system may not have been equipped to solve. A large, dense urban population is inherently more vulnerable to epidemic disease than a dispersed rural one. Researchers have found evidence of what appear to be periods of elevated mortality at Cahokia, though the causes are difficult to determine from the archaeological record alone. Crowding, sanitation problems, and the concentration of people from diverse origins, each carrying different disease exposures, could have made the city a dangerous place to live. There is also the question of political succession. Sacred kingship systems are notoriously vulnerable to succession crises. When a ruler whose authority rested on personal charisma and claimed divine connection died, the transition to a new ruler was always potentially destabilizing. If the new ruler could not maintain the same degree of authority, if factions competed for power, if subordinate communities took advantage of the transition to reassert their independence, the whole system could begin to unravel. Cahokia's political system left no written records, so the specific succession crises it faced are invisible to us. But the structural vulnerability was real and significant. The decline of Cahokia was not a sudden collapse. It was a long, uneven process that stretched across more than a century. Population began to fall, probably from some combination of emigration, reduced fertility, and elevated mortality. The construction of new monumental architecture slowed and eventually stopped. Outlying communities that had been within Cahokia's orbit began to pull away, either moving to new locations or reorganizing under different political arrangements. The city contracted toward its core. By around 1250 Common Era, Cahokia was clearly a diminished place compared to its peak. The population had dropped significantly. Many of the residential neighborhoods that had been densely packed a century earlier were now abandoned or sparsely occupied. The political system that had organized labor on a continental scale was no longer functioning at that level. But the city was not yet dead. A reduced population continued to live there, and some degree of monumental activity continued for at least another generation or two. By around 1300 Common Era, Cahokia appears to have been effectively abandoned as a major urban center. The exact date is uncertain, and researchers debate whether there was ever a complete and final abandonment or whether a small residual population remained for some time after the main urban phase ended. What is clear is that by the early 14th century, the city that had once rivaled London was no longer functioning as a city. The great mounds stood empty. The plazas were overgrown. The palisade had rotted away. Where did the people go? This is one of the most compelling and least resolved questions in North American archaeology. Some researchers have argued that descendants of the Cahokian population can be traced to specific later communities, particularly among the Osage, the Quapaw, or other Siouan-speaking peoples of the central interior. Others have pointed to possible connections with the Degahan Sioux or with the ancestors of the Natchez people of the lower Mississippi, whose elaborate political system and sacred chieftainship showed some similarities to what we know of Cahokia. Still others have suggested that Cahokia's population dispersed widely, contributing to the genetic and cultural ancestry of many different communities across the interior. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The absence of written records, combined with the enormous disruption caused by European contact, epidemic disease, and forced migration in the centuries after Cahokia's decline, makes it very difficult to trace specific population continuities. What we can say is that the people of Cahokia did not simply disappear. They moved, they merged with other communities, they carried memories and practices and knowledge with them, and their descendants are almost certainly among the Native American peoples of the interior today. The immediate consequences of Cahokia's decline were felt across a wide area. Communities that had organized their economic and political lives around their relationship with Cahokia had to find new ways of sustaining themselves. Trade networks that had flowed through the city were disrupted. Communities that had been subordinate to Cahokian authority were now free to reorganize on their own terms, and many of them did, developing new political arrangements that were often more decentralized and more resilient than the highly centralized Cahokian system. In the broader Mississippi Valley and its tributaries, the period after Cahokia's decline saw the emergence of new Mississippian chiefdoms, smaller and less centralized than Cahokia, but sharing many of its cultural features. These later Mississippian societies, which persisted in various forms until European contact, and in some cases well beyond it, were in many ways the heirs of the Cahokian tradition. They built platform mounds, maintained elaborate ceremonial systems, practiced intensive maize agriculture, and organized themselves around hereditary chiefs whose authority was legitimized by sacred ancestry and ritual knowledge. But none of them achieved anything close to Cahokia's scale. The medium-term consequences of Cahokia's rise and fall extended even further. The spread of intensive maize agriculture, which Cahokia had both benefited from and accelerated, transformed the human ecology of a huge area of North America. Communities across the interior shifted from mixed subsistence strategies to greater dependence on maize. a change that brought both advantages and vulnerabilities. Maize agriculture could support larger populations and more complex political organizations, but it also made communities more vulnerable to drought, crop failure, and the social stresses that come with inequality and resource competition. The southeastern ceremonial complex, the system of religious symbols and practices that Cahokia had done so much to spread and elaborate, continued to influence communities across the interior long after Cahokia itself was gone. The imagery of the falcon warrior, the chunky player, the cross-in-circle cosmogram, and other Cahokian motifs appears on objects from sites across the southeast, the Midwest, and the plains for centuries after Cahokia's decline. The city was gone, but the ideas it had spread were not. Chunky, it is worth pausing to explain, was a game played with a stone disc and spears, in which players threw their spears to predict where the rolling disc would stop. It sounds simple, but it was deeply embedded in Cahokian political and ritual life. Chunky courts have been found at Cahokia and at many sites across the Mississippian world. The game appears to have served as a mechanism for social bonding, political competition, and ritual activity. It was so central to Cahokian culture that some researchers have argued it was one of the primary vehicles through which Cahokian influence spread to other communities. People who adopted Chunky were, in a sense, adopting a piece of the Cahokian world. When European explorers first penetrated the interior of North America in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered the descendants of the Mississippian world that Cahokia had helped create. Hernando de Soto's expedition, which traveled through the southeastern interior between 1539 and 1542 Common Era, encountered numerous Mississippian chiefdoms, some of them still maintaining platform mounds, elaborate ceremonies, and hereditary chiefly authority. These were not the societies of Cahokia's peak, but they were recognizably part of the same cultural tradition. What de Soto and the other early European explorers did not find, because it had been gone for 2 centuries by then, was Cahokia itself. By the time Europeans reached the American bottom, the great city was buried under centuries of vegetation and soil. The mounds were still visible, but their builders were unknown. The local Native American peoples whom French explorers encountered in the late 17th century, the Cahokia, the Tamaroa, and other Illinois Confederacy peoples, did not claim to have built the mounds. Whether this was because they truly had no memory of the connection, or because the memory had been lost over the long centuries of disruption between Cahokia's decline and European contact, is impossible to say. French missionaries and traders who settled in the American bottom in the early 18th century encountered the mounds and were puzzled by them. They gave names to some of the features of the landscape, and it is from this period that the name Cahokia comes, applied first to one of the Illinois peoples living nearby and then, much later, to the ancient city itself. The actual name that the city's builders used for their home is unknown and may never be recovered. The mounds attracted curiosity and speculation throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Early American scholars and travelers, confronted with the evidence of large-scale earthwork construction in the interior of North America, often refused to believe that the ancestors of the Native American peoples they knew could have built such things. A persistent and deeply racist tradition of scholarship attributed the mounds to lost European civilizations, wandering Welsh princes, survivors of Atlantis, or any number of other imagined builders, rather than accepting the obvious truth that the indigenous peoples of North America were perfectly capable of constructing monumental architecture. This tradition, sometimes called the mound builder myth, persisted well into the 19th century and caused real harm, both by distorting the historical record and by providing intellectual cover for the dispossession of Native American peoples. The scientific study of Cahokia began in earnest in the 20th century, with systematic excavations revealing the true scale and complexity of the site. Researchers gradually pieced together the outlines of what Cahokia had been, though many questions remain unresolved. The site was designated a World Heritage Site by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization in 1982, one of only a handful of sites in the United States to receive that designation, a recognition of its global significance. Modern research has continued to transform our understanding of Cahokia. LIDAR surveys, which use laser pulses to map the ground surface beneath vegetation, have revealed the full extent of the mound complex and identified features that were not visible from the ground. Isotope analysis has illuminated the geographic origins of the city's population. Archaeobotanical research has traced the development of maize agriculture and its role in Cahokia's rise. Geophysical surveys have identified buried features without excavation, allowing researchers to map the city's layout in unprecedented detail. One of the most significant recent discoveries is the evidence for what some researchers have called a founding event. a specific and dramatic moment of urban creation around 1000 Common Era. The evidence suggests that the transformation of Cahokia from a large village to a city happened within a remarkably short period, possibly within a single generation. This implies that the founding of Cahokia was not a gradual organic process, but a deliberate act of political and religious creation, driven by specific individuals with a specific vision. Who those individuals were, what motivated them, and how they achieved such rapid transformation are questions that the archaeological record cannot fully answer, but they are among the most fascinating in all of North American history. The question of what Cahokia's founders were trying to create is deeply interesting. Some researchers have argued that the city's layout reflects a sophisticated cosmological program, in which the spatial organization of the built environment was designed to mirror and reinforce a particular vision of cosmic order. The alignment of Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and the surrounding mound groups with cardinal directions and astronomical events suggests a deliberate attempt to make the city a physical model of the universe as its builders understood it. This would have been both a spiritual statement and a political one. The ruler at the center of a cosmically ordered city was not just a political leader, but a living axis of the world. The scale of Monk's Mound itself deserves emphasis. The mound was built in multiple stages over several centuries, but its core was established early in Cahokia's urban phase. At its final dimensions, it covered an area of roughly 5.5 hectares at the base, and rose about 30 meters in height, with a flat top that once supported a large wooden building, probably the residence or ceremonial hall of the paramount chief. The total volume of earth moved to create Monk's Mound is estimated at around 814,000 cubic meters. Every basket of that earth was carried by human hands, without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. The labor investment was staggering, and it speaks to the degree of political mobilization that Cahokia's rulers were able to achieve. The surrounding mound complex included more than 120 mounds of various sizes and shapes within an area of roughly 14 square kilometers. Platform mounds, conical mounds, ridgetop mounds, and paired mound groups each served different functions in the city's ceremonial and political landscape. The organization of these mounds was not random. It reflected a carefully planned spatial hierarchy, with the most important structures closest to the central axis of Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza, and lesser structures arranged outward in patterns that encoded social and political relationships. The wooden palisade that enclosed the central precinct was another remarkable engineering achievement. Researchers have estimated that each construction of the wall required somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 large wooden posts, each requiring a mature tree. The posts were set in deep trenches and rose several meters above the ground, creating a formidable barrier. Bastions at regular intervals allowed defenders to cover the full length of the wall. The wall was not just defensive, it was also a powerful symbolic statement, marking the boundary between the sacred inner city and the profane outer world, between the space of the ruler and the space of ordinary people. Inside the palisade, the elite residential and ceremonial buildings were constructed on the summits of the platform mounds, elevating the most important people and activities above the level of the surrounding city. This vertical separation reinforced the social hierarchy in a very physical way. To approach the paramount chief, you had to climb. The view from the top of Monk's Mound would have been extraordinary, encompassing the entire city and the surrounding floodplain in every direction, a visual demonstration of the ruler's command over the landscape. The ordinary people of Cahokia lived in the residential zones outside the palisade, in rectangular houses built of wooden posts with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. These houses were modest by the standards of the elite, but they were not primitive. They were organized in clusters that may have reflected kinship groups or occupational specializations. Between the houses, researchers have found evidence of gardens, storage pits, hearths, and the debris of daily life. Ceramic vessels, stone tools, food remains, and the occasional personal ornament. The diet of ordinary Cahokians was dominated by maize, supplemented by beans, squash, wild plants, fish, deer, and other game. The reliance on maize was so heavy that researchers have found evidence of nutritional stress in skeletal remains, including signs of iron deficiency and dental problems associated with a high-carbohydrate diet. The city's food supply was not always adequate or balanced, even at the height of Cahokia's power. Life in the city was not uniformly comfortable, and the benefits of urban life were not equally distributed. The health data from Cahokia's cemeteries reveals a complicated picture. Elite individuals, buried with elaborate grave goods and in specially constructed burial facilities, show generally better health indicators than non-elite individuals buried in simpler graves. But even among the elite, life expectancy was not dramatically longer than among the general population. The city was a place of both opportunity and risk, and the risks were not equally shared. The craft production of Cahokia was another dimension of its urban complexity. Specialized craft workers produced objects in copper, shell, stone, ceramic, and other materials for both local use and long-distance exchange. The most distinctive Cahokian ceramic tradition, the Ramey incised style, featured complex curvilinear designs derived from cosmological imagery, particularly the motifs of the southeastern ceremonial complex. These vessels were not just functional containers, they were carriers of meaning, and their presence at sites far from Cahokia testifies to the reach of the city's cultural influence. Copper working at Cahokia was particularly significant. Copper from the Great Lakes region was hammered into thin sheets and shaped into objects of great symbolic importance: falcon warrior plaques, ear spools, celts, and other forms that appear in elite burials across the Mississippian world. Copper was not just a valuable material, it was a sacred one, associated with the sun, with the sky world, and with the power of rulers and warriors. The ability to control the supply and distribution of copper was a significant source of political power, and Cahokia's position at the center of the interior trade network gave its rulers a decisive advantage in this regard. The shell trade was equally important. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, particularly large whelk shells used to make drinking cups for ceremonial use, and smaller shells used to make beads, were among the most valued trade goods in the Mississippian world. The shell bead platform in Mound 72, with its 20,000 beads, gives some sense of the quantities involved. The logistics of moving shells from the Gulf Coast to the American bottom, a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers, required sustained organizational effort and reliable trade relationships. The religious life of Cahokia centered on a cosmological system that divided the universe into three realms: the upper world of the sky, associated with order, the sun and the falcon; the lower world of water and the underworld, associated with chaos, fertility, and the serpent; and the middle world of human habitation, where these forces were in constant tension and balance. The role of the paramount chief was to maintain the balance between these realms, performing the ceremonies and sacrifices necessary to keep the cosmos in order. This cosmological framework was not unique to Cahokia. It was shared, in various forms across a wide area of eastern North America. But Cahokia appears to have been its most elaborate and powerful institutional expression. The ceremonies performed at Cahokia were large-scale public events involving the entire urban population and visitors from the surrounding region. Communal feasting, ritual games including chunky, dances, and probably sacrificial offerings were all part of the ceremonial calendar. These events served multiple functions simultaneously. They reinforced social bonds, demonstrated the power and generosity of the ruling elite, connected the community to the cosmic order, and provided occasions for the redistribution of resources. The political and the religious were not separate domains in Cahokian life. They were aspects of a single integrated system. The question of how Cahokia's political system actually worked in practice, how authority was transmitted, how decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, is one that the archaeological record can only partially answer. There are no written records, no administrative documents, no royal annals. What we have are the physical remains of buildings, objects, and bodies, interpreted through the lens of comparative ethnography and careful archaeological analysis. The picture that emerges is of a hierarchical system with a paramount chief at the top, supported by a class of subordinate elites who managed specific functions and territories, and sustained by the labor and tribute of a large non-elite population. Whether the paramount chief's authority was truly absolute, or whether it was constrained by councils, kinship obligations, or the need to maintain consensus among subordinate elites, is not clear. The evidence from Mound 72 suggests that at least some rulers had the power to command human sacrifice on a significant scale, which implies a degree of coercive authority that goes well beyond ordinary chieftainship. But coercive authority alone cannot sustain a large urban population. The city also needed to offer genuine benefits to the people who lived in it, and the evidence suggests that it did, at least for most of its history. The question of why Cahokia declined remains genuinely open, and it is worth being honest about the limits of what we know. The most careful scholarly view is that the decline resulted from the interaction of multiple factors: environmental degradation, climate stress, agricultural shortfalls, political instability, social inequality, epidemic disease, and possibly external pressure from hostile communities. No single cause is sufficient. The collapse of a complex society is always the result of multiple systems failing at the same time, with each failure making the others worse. What we can say with some confidence is that Cahokia's very success contained the seeds of its vulnerability. The concentration of population in a single large city created environmental pressure that could not be sustained indefinitely. The centralization of political authority in a sacred chieftainship created a system that was powerful when it worked but catastrophically fragile when it began to fail. The dependence on reliable agricultural surpluses made the city vulnerable to climate variability in ways that more dispersed communities were not. And the inequality that was built into the Cahokian system from the beginning created social tensions that could become explosive under conditions of stress. There is something deeply instructive about this pattern. Cahokia is not the only complex society in history to have grown rapidly, achieved impressive scale, and then collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The same pattern appears in the archaeological record of many ancient societies around the world, from the early cities of Mesopotamia to the Bronze Age palaces of the Aegean. The specific details differ enormously, but the underlying dynamic, in which the mechanisms of success become the sources of vulnerability, is remarkably consistent. The legacy of Cahokia is complex and still being worked out. For Native American peoples, particularly those who may be descended from Cahokia's population, the site carries a significance that goes beyond academic interest. It is evidence of the sophistication, ambition, and organizational capacity of their ancestors, a counter to the persistent myth that North America before European contact was a sparsely populated wilderness inhabited by simple, unchanging peoples. Cahokia demonstrates that the indigenous peoples of North America were capable of building cities, organizing complex political systems, managing long-distance trade networks, and developing sophisticated cosmological and artistic traditions. This is not a minor historical footnote. It is a fundamental truth about human history in the Americas. For archaeologists and historians, Cahokia presents a continuing set of research challenges and opportunities. The site is enormous, and only a fraction of it has been systematically excavated. New techniques from LiDAR mapping to ancient DNA analysis are opening up new lines of investigation. Questions about the city's founding, its political structure, its population composition, its economic organization, and the causes of its decline are all still actively debated. Cahokia is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing inquiry. For the broader public, Cahokia offers something perhaps even more valuable: a reminder that the history of North America did not begin with European contact. The continent had its own histories, its own cities, its own empires and collapses, its own great experiments in human organization, long before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. Cahokia was one of the most ambitious of those experiments, and its story deserves to be as well known as the stories of Rome, or Babylon, or Teotihuacan. The site today is a state historic site in Illinois, managed by the state government and open to the public. The mounds are still there, still impressive, still capable of conveying some sense of the scale of what was once built here. Monk's Mound can be climbed, and from its summit on a clear day you can see the Gateway Arch in St. Louis across the river, the modern city rising where the ancient one once stood. The juxtaposition is striking. Two great urban centers separated by 1,000 years, built on the same landscape, sustained by the same river system, facing many of the same fundamental challenges of human organization. The interpretive center at the site does an admirable job of presenting what researchers know about Cahokia while being honest about what remains unknown. Reconstructions of Cahokian buildings, displays of artifacts, and explanations of the archaeological methods used to study the site help visitors grasp the reality of what once existed here. But even the best museum display cannot fully convey the lived experience of a city of 20,000 people, the noise and smell and movement and ceremony of a place that was, for a few centuries, one of the most significant urban centers in the world. The name Cahokia itself is worth reflecting on. It was not the name the city's builders used. It was borrowed from a group of Illinois peoples who lived in the region when French explorers arrived, and applied to the ancient site only centuries later. The true name of the city, the name its founders gave it, the name its inhabitants used when they spoke of their home, is one of the many things that the silence of history has taken from us. We study Cahokia through its physical remains because that is all we have. The voices of its people are gone, but the physical remains are eloquent in their own way. The sheer mass of Monk's Mound speaks of collective will and organized effort on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The careful astronomical alignments of the wood hinges speak of a society that paid close attention to the movements of the sky and organized its ceremonial life around them. The trade goods from distant places speak of a city that was connected to a vast world beyond its own horizon. And the burials, with their dramatic inequalities of treatment, speak of a society that was deeply stratified, where some people commanded and others obeyed, where some were buried with 20,000 shell beads and others were laid in mass graves without ceremony. Cahokia was not a paradise. It was a city with all the complexity, inequality, ambition, and fragility that cities have always carried. It was built by people who were trying to solve the same fundamental problems that all complex societies face: how to organize large numbers of people, how to produce and distribute resources, how to maintain political authority, how to make sense of the world through shared belief and ceremony. They found solutions that worked for a time. And then, like every complex society before and since, they encountered the limits of those solutions. The story of Cahokia is, in the end, a story about the human capacity for both creation and destruction. The same organizational energy that built Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza also drove the deforestation that degraded the surrounding landscape. The same political system that attracted tens of thousands of people to the city also produced the mass sacrifices of Mound 72. The same agricultural intensification that fed a city of 20,000 also created the ecological vulnerabilities that contributed to the city's decline. These are not contradictions. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. Every great civilization in history has faced this same paradox, that the mechanisms of success are also the sources of vulnerability, that growth creates the conditions for decline, that the concentration of power generates the forces that will eventually challenge it. Cahokia did not fail because its people were less capable or less intelligent than the people of other great civilizations. It failed because it was subject to the same laws of complexity and fragility that govern all human attempts to build something larger than any individual can control. What makes Cahokia's story worth telling, worth studying, worth climbing the steps of Monk's Mound to contemplate, is precisely this universality. The specific details are uniquely North American, rooted in a specific landscape, a specific agricultural tradition, a specific cosmological system. But the underlying human story of ambition and organization, of creation and collapse, of a society that reached for something extraordinary and found both greatness and its limits, is a story that belongs to all of humanity. We do not know the names of the rulers who built Cahokia. We do not know the prayers they offered or the songs they sang or the stories they told their children about the meaning of the great mound at the center of their world. But we know that they were here, that they built something extraordinary, that their city shaped the history of a continent, and that the mounds they left behind still stand, patient and enormous, waiting for us to pay attention. If you have followed this story all the way to its end, you already understand something that most people do not, that North America had its own age of cities, its own experiments with urban complexity, its own rise and fall of great powers, centuries before European contact changed everything. That knowledge changes how you see this continent and its history. What question did this story leave you with? Leave it in the comments below. We read everyone. If you found this documentary worth your time, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Your support is what makes it possible to keep producing serious, deeply researched history like this. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden histories of the ancient world, head to the channel and open the history playlist. There are many more stories waiting for you there, each one as surprising, as human, and as worth knowing as this one.